Officer Marcus Jennings, a seasoned cop nearing retirement, thought he'd seen it all in his years on the force. But when a routine call about a suspected burglary led him to the home of Nate Walker, an 82-year-old black veteran, Marcus had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down. As he approached the quiet house, Marcus was met with a scene that defied his expectations. What he discovered inside would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, compassion, and the harsh realities faced by veterans of color long after their service ends. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and if you enjoy this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe. The night settled over the small town of Hollowford, like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of the day and casting long shadows across the empty streets. In their patrol car, officers Marcus Jennings and Sandra Torres sat in companionable silence, the soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminating their faces. Marcus, a weathered 58-year-old white man with salt and pepper hair, glanced at his partner. Sandra, in her mid-30s, had been assigned to him just a few months ago. He appreciated her quiet competence and sharp mind. "So, Sandra," Marcus broke the silence, his voice gravelly from years of late-night patrols, "how are you finding Hollowford so far? Must be quite a change from the big city." Sandra's lips quirked into a small smile. "It's different, quieter. Sometimes I miss the constant buzz of the city, but there's something to be said for knowing your neighbors." Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Takes some getting used to, that's for sure, but give it time. This town has a way of growing on you." Their casual conversation was abruptly cut short by the crackle of the radio. Dispatch's voice, crisp and professional, filled the car. "All units, we have a 911 report of a suspected burglary at 1247 Winbrook Street. Caller identifies as Nate Walker, 82-year-old black male, veteran status." The atmosphere in the car shifted instantly. Marcus straightened in his seat, all traces of relaxation gone from his posture. Sandra was already reaching for the radio to acknowledge the call. "Copy that, dispatch," Sandra responded, her voice steady. "Unit 14 responding. We'll be there in about 5 minutes." As Marcus flipped on the siren and pulled out onto the empty street, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Burglaries weren't uncommon in Hollowford, but something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the mention of the caller's age and veteran status, or perhaps it was just the quietness of the night. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine break-in. "You know this Walker fellow?" Sandra asked as they sped through the deserted streets, red and blue lights painting the buildings they passed. Marcus shook his head. "Name doesn't ring a bell. Winbrook Street's on the outskirts of town, kind of isolated. Not many folks living out that way anymore." Sandra nodded, her eyes scanning the darkened houses as they passed. "Seems like an odd target for a burglar. Not much out there but old farms and abandoned properties." "Sometimes that's exactly what they're looking for," Marcus replied, his voice grim. "Isolated targets, less chance of being seen or heard." As they turned onto Winbrook Street, the houses grew fewer and farther between. The night seemed to press in on them, the beam of their headlights barely penetrating the darkness ahead. In the distance, a solitary porch light flickered weakly, a lone beacon in the gloom. Marcus slowed the car as they approached the address. The uneasy feeling in his gut intensified. Something about this whole situation felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him to be on high alert. "Keep your eyes open," he murmured to Sandra as they pulled up to the curb. "Something doesn't feel right about this." Sandra nodded, her hand instinctively checking her holster as they stepped out of the car. The night air was crisp and cold, their breath forming small clouds in front of their faces. As Marcus and Sandra approached the house, the full extent of its neglect became apparent. The modest, weather-beaten structure seemed to sag under the weight of years of disrepair. A light dusting of snow covered the overgrown lawn, giving the scene an eerie, muted quality. On the porch stood a figure, barely visible in the weak light cast by the flickering bulb above, As they drew closer, the officers could make out an elderly black man, bundled in thick, oversized clothes that seemed to swallow his frame. Beside him, an old Labrador retriever stood quietly, its graying muzzle and subdued demeanor a stark contrast to the usual excitement dogs showed at the arrival of visitors. "Mr. Walker," Marcus called out as they approached, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm Officer Jennings, and this is Officer Torres. We received your call about a possible break-in." Nate Walker nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if unused to conversation. "That's right, officers. Appreciate you coming out here so quick." He gestured towards the back of the house with a shaky hand. "Heard a ruckus earlier, and when I went to check, saw the window back there was busted. Buddy here started barking up a storm, must have scared him off." At the mention of his name, the old dog's tail gave a half-hearted wag, but he remained close to Nate's side, watching the officers with wary eyes. "Mind if we take a look around, Mr. Walker?" Sandra asked, her tone gentle but professional. Nate nodded again, stepping off the porch with careful, unsteady steps. "Course not. Follow me." As they made their way around the side of the house, Marcus couldn't help but notice how Nate seemed to struggle with each step, his breathing labored even from this short walk. Buddy kept pace with his owner, moving slowly but staying close, as if ready to offer support if needed. The snow crunched underfoot as they walked, the sound seeming to echo in the quiet night. The dark bulk of the house loomed beside them, windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. As they rounded the corner to the back of the property, Marcus's flashlight beam caught the glint of broken glass on the ground. "There it is," Nate said, pointing to a window near the back door. The glass was indeed shattered, shards scattered on the snow-covered ground below. Marcus approached the window, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. He examined the break pattern, noting the size of the hole and the distribution of glass. Something about it didn't quite add up, but he couldn't put his finger on what was bothering him. Sandra, meanwhile, had begun to circle the property, her flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. "I've got some footprints here," she called out. "Looks like they lead away from the window and towards the street." Marcus nodded, making mental notes. He turned back to Nate, who was standing still, one hand resting on Buddy's head. "Mr. Walker, did you hear or see anything else? Any vehicles, voices, anything unusual at all?" Nate shook his head slowly. "Can't say I did, officer. Just heard the glass break, and then Buddy here started raising hell. By the time I got to the window, whoever it was had hightailed it out of here." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the area one more time. The broken window, the footprints, it all seemed to line up with Nate's story, but something still felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice careful and measured, "would you mind if we took a look inside, just to make sure everything's secure and there's no other damage?" For a moment, something flashed across Nate's face. Hesitation, perhaps even fear. But it was gone so quickly, Marcus wasn't sure he'd seen it at all. Then Nate nodded, his expression neutral once more. "Suppose that'd be all right. Come on in." As they made their way back to the front of the house, Marcus exchanged a glance with Sandra. She gave him a slight nod, confirming that she too sensed something wasn't quite right. The porch steps creaked ominously under their weight as they climbed up to the front door. Nate fumbled with his keys for a moment before managing to unlock the door. As it swung open with a protesting groan, a wave of warm air washed over them, carrying with it a musty smell that spoke of long-closed windows and neglect. Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever they might find inside. As they crossed the threshold, Buddy following close behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far more complex and potentially far more troubling than a simple attempted burglary. The interior of Nate Walker's home was a stark contrast to the cold, quiet night outside. As Marcus and Sandra stepped inside, they were immediately struck by the oppressive warmth that enveloped them. The air was thick with the smell of must and damp, mingled with other, less identifiable odors. Marcus's eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light. As his vision cleared, he found himself surveying a scene of quiet desperation. The small living room was cluttered, years of accumulated possessions piled high on every available surface. Stacks of old newspapers teetered precariously, their yellowed pages a testament to the passage of time. In one corner, a collection of empty dog food bowls sat gathering dust. "The window's this way," Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he led them through the cramped space. Buddy padded along silently beside him, the old dog's nails clicking softly on the worn linoleum floor. As they made their way through the house, Marcus couldn't help but notice how uncomfortably warm it was. Despite the frigid temperatures outside, the interior of the house felt almost tropical. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, wondering about the source of the heat. They reached the kitchen, where the broken window was located. Glass shards glittered on the floor beneath it, catching the weak light from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Marcus approached carefully, mindful of the evidence, and began to examine the damage. As he inspected the window, he became increasingly aware of Nate's labored breathing behind him. He turned to find the elderly man leaning heavily against the kitchen counter, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Walker," Marcus said, concern evident in his voice, "are you feeling all right? Would you like to sit down?" Nate waved off his concern with a trembling hand. "I'm fine, officer. Just a bit winded is all. Don't you worry about me." But Marcus couldn't help but worry. Now that they were inside, in better light, he could see just how frail Nate looked. The oversized clothes he wore seemed to hang off him, as if they belonged to a much larger man. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "If you're sure," Marcus said, not entirely convinced. "Do you mind if I ask you a few more questions about what happened tonight?" Nate nodded, straightening up with visible effort. "Course not. Ask away." As Marcus began to question Nate about the events leading up to the alleged break-in, Sandra continued to survey the kitchen. Her eyes fell on the stove and she frowned, moving closer to investigate. "Mr. Walker," she called out, interrupting Marcus's questioning, "is your stove supposed to be on?" Nate's eyes widened for a moment before he quickly schooled his expression. "Oh, that? Yeah, it's fine. I just use it to help heat the place sometimes, you know. The old boiler gave out last winter, and I don't have the money to repair it. Electricity's expensive these days, and the stove, well, it's all I've got to keep warm." Marcus and Sandra exchanged a look of alarm. The realization hit them both at the same time. Nate wasn't just using the stove for a little extra warmth. It was likely his only source of heat. "Mr. Walker," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm, "using your stove like that can be very dangerous. It's a fire hazard, and the gas fumes can be harmful to your health. How long have you been heating your home this way?" Nate's shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to go out of him all at once. "A while now," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Can't afford to keep the electricity running for heat. It's just me and Buddy here, and we make do." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach as he began to piece together the situation. The cluttered house, the empty dog bowls, Nate's frail appearance. It all pointed to a man struggling to survive, too proud or too afraid to ask for help. "Nate," Marcus said, dropping the formality, "when was the last time you saw a doctor, or had a proper meal?" Nate's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and shame. "I don't need no charity," he snapped, some of his earlier fire returning. "I've managed just fine on my own all these years. I don't need nobody's help." But even as he spoke, his voice wavered, and Marcus could see the truth in his eyes. Nate Walker was a man at the end of his rope, clinging desperately to his pride, even as his world crumbled around him. Marcus opened his mouth to speak again, to offer help or reassurance, but before he could, a soft whine from Buddy caught their attention. The old dog had moved to the corner of the kitchen, where he now lay with his head on his paws, looking up at them with sad, tired eyes. The sight seemed to deflate Nate completely. He shuffled over to Buddy, lowering himself painfully to the floor beside his faithful companion. As he stroked the dog's graying fur, Marcus could see tears forming in the old man's eyes. "I'm doing my best, boy," Nate whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm doing my best." The scene before them was heart-wrenching. What had started as a routine call about a possible break-in had uncovered a far more devastating situation. Marcus and Sandra stood in silence, the weight of what they had discovered settling heavily upon them. The uneasy quiet of the kitchen was punctuated only by the soft wheezing of the old gas stove and Buddy's occasional whimpers. Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing as he tried to process the gravity of the situation before him. The broken window that had brought them here now seemed like the least of their concerns. Sandra, ever the professional, was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Walker," she began gently, "I understand you're doing your best to manage, but using the stove for heat is extremely dangerous. The risk of fire or carbon monoxide poisoning is very high." Nate's hand stilled on Buddy's fur, his weathered face a mask of stubbornness and pride. "What choice do I have?" he asked, his voice a mixture of defiance and despair. "It's either this or freeze to death, at least this way. Buddy stays warm too." Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. The love between the old man and his dog was palpable, a bond forged through years of companionship and shared hardship. It was clear that Nate would risk everything to keep Buddy comfortable, even at the cost of his own safety. "Nate," Marcus said, crouching down to meet the old man's eyes, "I know you're trying to take care of Buddy, but this isn't safe for either of you. There are other options, people who can help." "Help?" Nate interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Where was all this help when I came back from the war? When my Mary passed and I was left all alone? No, officer. I learned a long time ago that the only person I can count on is myself." The pain in Nate's voice was raw, a wound that had never truly healed. Marcus felt a surge of empathy for the old veteran, understanding all too well the challenges faced by those who had served their country, only to be forgotten upon their return. "I hear you, Nate," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with genuine understanding. "The system has failed many veterans like yourself, but that doesn't mean you have to face this alone. There are resources available, people who want to help." "Resources?" Nate scoffed, though his voice held more weariness than anger now. "You mean more forms to fill out? More offices to sit in, waiting to be told I don't qualify? No, thank you. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime." Marcus opened his mouth to argue further, but the look of determination on Nate's face stopped him. He realized that pushing too hard now might only drive Nate further away from accepting help. Sandra, sensing the tension, stepped in. "Mr. Walker, we can't force you to accept assistance, but we are obligated to report the unsafe living conditions. Someone from social services may be in contact with you." Nate's expression hardened. "You do what you have to do, officers, but I've managed this long on my own, and I'll keep on managing." Marcus and Sandra exchanged helpless glances. They both knew they couldn't leave Nate in these conditions, but they also couldn't forcibly remove him from his home without due process. "All right, Mr. Walker," Marcus said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll be on our way, but please think about what we've said. Your safety and Buddy's is important." As they made their way to the front door, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of failure. They were leaving Nate in a dangerous situation, and there seemed to be nothing they could do about it right now. Standing on the porch, the cold night air a stark contrast to the stifling warmth of the house, Marcus felt a weight settling on his shoulders. "Nate," Marcus began, his breath visible in the frigid air, "I want you to have my card. If you need anything, day or night, I want you to call me. Doesn't matter what it is." He held out a small white business card, the police department logo crisp and official in the corner. Nate stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light. "I don't need charity," Nate said finally, his voice gruff. His eyes, however, betrayed a mixture of pride and fear. "The communities don't like to help someone like me of a different race anyway. A black man, I mean." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of pain and disappointment. Marcus felt a pang in his chest, recognizing the deep-seated hurt behind Nate's statement. "This isn't charity, Nate," Marcus replied, his voice soft but firm. "This is one man offering to help another. Race doesn't factor into it. Sometimes it's harder to ask for help than to give it, but we all need it now and then." Nate's eyes met Marcus's, searching for any sign of insincerity or pity. Finding none, he slowly reached out and took the card, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "I've been let down before," Nate admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "People make promises, but when it comes down to it, they don't want to deal with an old black veteran and his problems." Marcus nodded, understanding the layers of distrust built up over years of disappointment and discrimination. "I can't speak for others, Nate, but I can speak for myself. When I offer help, I mean it. No strings attached, no expectations. Just one human being looking out for another." Nate looked down at the card in his hand, then over at Buddy, who was sitting patiently by his side. The old dog's tail thumped softly against the porch, a quiet show of support. "I'll think about it," Nate said finally, tucking the card into his pocket. It wasn't a full acceptance of help, but it was a start. As Nate turned to head back inside, Marcus felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to do more, to insist that Nate come with them now, to get him and Buddy to safety immediately. But he knew that pushing too hard could backfire, causing Nate to retreat further into his shell of self-reliance. "Remember, Nate," Marcus called out as the old man reached for his door, "that number works any time, day or night. Don't hesitate to use it." Nate paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. Without turning back, he nodded once, then disappeared into the house, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, the cold night air biting at his exposed skin. He felt a mix of emotions, concern for Nate and Buddy's safety, frustration at his inability to do more, and a glimmer of hope that Nate might eventually reach out for help. As he walked back to the patrol car where Sandra was waiting, Marcus knew that this case would stay with him. He had seen many difficult situations in his years on the force, but something about Nate's quiet desperation and stubborn pride had struck a chord deep within him. "We did what we could," Sandra said as Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, sensing her partner's ongoing distress. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I know, but sometimes doing what we can doesn't feel like enough." As they drove away from Nate's house, the silence in the car was palpable. Both officers were lost in thought, the weight of the situation heavy on their shoulders. The rest of their shift was filled with tension, the image of the poor veteran in his dangerous living conditions haunting their minds. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge their perceptions, test their dedication, and ultimately remind them of the profound impact a single act of kindness could have. Several days passed since that fateful night at Nate Walker's house. Officer Marcus Jennings found himself going through the motions of his daily routine, but his mind constantly wandered back to the elderly veteran and his loyal companion, Buddy. The image of their precarious living situation haunted him, creeping into his thoughts during quiet moments on patrol and keeping him awake at night. Despite his best efforts to follow up through official channels, Marcus found himself hitting wall after wall of bureaucratic red tape. Social services were understaffed and overworked. Veteran affairs had a backlog a mile long, and without Nate's cooperation, there was little anyone could do to intervene directly. Marcus had tried to drive by Nate's house a couple of times during his shifts, but the old man never seemed to be outside, and the curtains remained firmly drawn. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that time was running out for Nate and Buddy. On this particular evening, Marcus had just finished a long, grueling shift. It had been a day filled with minor incidents, a fender bender downtown, a shoplifting case at the local convenience store, and a domestic dispute that thankfully didn't escalate. But throughout it all, his thoughts kept drifting back to the old house on Windbrook Street. As he trudged up the steps to his modest apartment, Marcus felt the weight of his badge more keenly than ever. He'd become a police officer to make a difference, to help people, but cases like Nate's made him question whether he was really doing enough. He had just settled into his worn armchair, a cold beer in hand, when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Marcus glanced at it, not recognizing the number. For a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. He was off duty after all, but something made him reach for the phone. "Hello, this is Officer Jennings," he answered, his voice tinged with the weariness of his long day. There was a pause on the other end, filled with the sound of labored breathing. Then a familiar voice, quieter and more broken than he remembered, came through. "Officer, it's Nate. Nate Walker." Marcus sat up straight, instantly alert, the fatigue of moments ago forgotten. "Nate, is everything all right?" Another pause, longer this time. When Nate spoke again, his voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "It's Buddy. He's not doing well. I don't know what to do." The desperation in Nate's voice was palpable, a far cry from the stubborn pride he had displayed just days ago. Marcus could hear the fear, the vulnerability that had finally pushed the old veteran to reach out. "What's wrong with Buddy, Nate?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his keys. He cradled the phone between his ear and shoulder as he quickly pulled on his jacket. Nate's voice cracked as he replied, "He won't eat. Hasn't for days. He's so weak, can barely lift his head. I can't lose him, officer. He's the only thing I have left." Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. He knew that Buddy wasn't just a pet to Nate. He was family, a lifeline, perhaps the only thing keeping the old man going. The thought of Nate losing his faithful companion sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Have you taken him to a vet?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. He was halfway down the stairs of his apartment building now, moving as quickly as he could. "I can't afford it," Nate admitted, the words coming out in a rush of shame and frustration. "I've been trying to save up, but between food and keeping the heat on, I just don't have enough. I thought I could handle it on my own, but—" His voice trailed off, and Marcus could hear the sound of muffled sobbing. The proud veteran who had stubbornly refused help just days ago was now breaking down, the weight of his situation finally becoming too much to bear alone. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment as he reached his car, feeling the weight of Nate's struggle. He knew that for the proud veteran to make this call, to admit he needed help, things must be dire indeed. "All right, Nate," Marcus said, his voice calm and reassuring as he started his car. "I'm on my way right now. We'll figure this out together, okay? Just hang in there and keep Buddy comfortable. I'll be there as soon as I can." There was a moment of silence on the other end, then a soft, barely audible, "Thank you." The vulnerability in those two simple words spoke volumes about the depths of Nate's desperation. As Marcus pulled out of his parking spot and headed towards Nate's house, his mind raced. He knew he was off duty, knew that there were probably protocols he should follow. But in that moment, none of that mattered. A man needed help, a man who had served his country, who had already given so much, and Marcus was determined to be there for him. The streets of Hollowford were quiet as Marcus drove, the lateness of the hour meaning there was little traffic. As he passed familiar landmarks, the old clock tower downtown, the park where he often saw families picnicking on weekends, Marcus couldn't help but think about how different the town must look to someone like Nate. Where Marcus saw a community, Nate had seen only isolation and indifference. As he turned onto Windbrook Street, Marcus steeled himself for what he might find. The neighborhood was dark, most houses already settled in for the night, but at the end of the street, a single porch light flickered weakly, a beacon in the gloom. Marcus pulled up in front of Nate's house, his headlights illuminating the overgrown yard for a moment before he shut off the engine. The house looked even more run down than he remembered, the peeling paint and sagging roof, a testament to years of neglect. Taking a deep breath, Marcus got out of his car and approached the front door. He could hear movement inside, the shuffling of slow, unsteady feet. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the door creaked open. Nate stood in the doorway, looking even more haggard than before. his face gaunt, his eyes sunken and filled with a mixture of worry and shame. "Officer Jennings," he said, his voice hoarse, "I thank you for coming." Marcus nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "Of course, Nate, that's what I'm here for. Now let's see what we can do for Buddy, all right?" As Nate stepped aside to let him in, Marcus couldn't help but feel that this late-night call was just the beginning. The real challenge, for Nate, for Buddy, and for Marcus himself, was only just beginning. The interior of Nate's house was much as Marcus remembered it, cluttered and in disrepair, with the musty smell of neglect hanging heavy in the air. But now there was an added layer of desperation to the scene, as if the very walls were absorbing Nate's distress. Marcus's eyes quickly scanned the room, finally settling on a corner where a ragged old blanket lay spread out. There, barely visible in the dim light, was Buddy. The old dog's breathing was labored, his once bright eyes now dull and unfocused. Kneeling beside Buddy, Marcus gently stroked the dog's fur. He could feel the animal's ribs protruding sharply under his hand, a clear sign of malnutrition. Buddy's tail gave a weak thump in response to Marcus's touch, but it was clear that the loyal companion was in a bad way. "How long has he been like this?" Marcus asked, looking up at Nate, who hovered anxiously nearby. Nate sank into a nearby chair, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his worry. "It's been getting worse for a while now," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been trying to take care of him, but—" His voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Marcus nodded encouragingly, sensing that Nate needed to talk, to unburden himself of the struggle he'd been facing alone for far too long. Slowly, haltingly, Nate began to open up. He spoke of the mounting bills, of the choice between keeping the heat on or buying food, of the nights he went to bed hungry so that Buddy could eat, of the shame he felt at not being able to provide better for his loyal friend. "I've been skipping meals," Nate confessed, his eyes fixed on Buddy's prone form. "Trying to save up for dog food, for vet bills, but it's never enough. Everything just keeps getting more expensive, and my pension, it doesn't go as far as it used to." Marcus listened, his heart heavy with the weight of Nate's words. He'd suspected that things were bad, but the reality was even more dire than he'd imagined. "Buddy's been with me since Mary passed," Nate continued, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's all I have left. I can't lose him too." The depth of Nate's love for Buddy was clear, as was the toll their situation had taken on both of them. Marcus could see now that this wasn't just about a sick dog. It was about a man who had lost everything except this one faithful companion, and who was now watching helplessly as even that slipped away. "Nate," Marcus said gently, choosing his words carefully, "Buddy needs medical attention, and frankly, so do you. You've been sacrificing your own health to care for him, haven't you?" Nate nodded slowly, shame evident in his expression. "I know it's foolish," he mumbled, "but what else could I do, Buddy? He's family." Marcus felt a surge of admiration for the old veteran's dedication, even as he recognized the desperate need for intervention. "It's not foolish to care, Nate," he said firmly, "but you don't have to do this alone anymore. Will you let me help you both?" For a long moment, Nate was silent, his internal struggle visible on his face. Years of pride, of self-reliance, of distrust in a system that had let him down time and again. All of it warred against the undeniable need for help. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Nate nodded. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since he'd entered the house. "You don't have to thank me, Nate. This is what community is about, looking out for each other. Now let's get Buddy the help he needs, all right?" As Marcus gently lifted Buddy into his arms, careful not to cause the weakened dog any additional discomfort, he couldn't help but reflect on the situation. What had started as a routine call about a suspected burglary had uncovered a far deeper, more devastating reality. One of isolation, poverty, and silent suffering. But as he carried Buddy out to his car with Nate following close behind, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that helping Nate and Buddy wouldn't be as simple as a trip to the vet, but he was determined to see it through, to show this proud veteran that he wasn't alone, that there was still good in the world. The veterinary clinic was quiet at this late hour, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the empty waiting room. Marcus had called ahead, explaining the emergency situation, and the on-call vet had agreed to meet them despite the lateness of the hour. As they waited for the vet to examine Buddy, Marcus couldn't help but notice how frail Nate looked under the unforgiving lights. The old veteran's eyes never left Buddy, who lay whimpering softly on the examination table. Dr. Sarah Chen, a young veterinarian with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, emerged from the examination room after what seemed like an eternity. Her expression was grave as she approached Marcus and Nate. "I've completed my examination," she began, her voice soft but professional. "Buddy is in a critical condition. He's suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration, and there are some age-related issues complicating matters. We need to start treatment immediately if we want to give him the best chance of recovery." Nate's face crumpled at her words, the last vestiges of his composure finally giving way. I can't afford," he began, his voice breaking. Before he could finish, Marcus stepped forward. "Don't worry about the cost, Nate," he said firmly. "We'll figure it out." Turning to Dr. Chen, he added, "Please do whatever needs to be done for Buddy." The vet nodded, a look of understanding passing between her and Marcus. As she turned to head back to the examination room, Nate reached out and caught Marcus's arm. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing all this for me, for us?" Marcus was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because every life has value, Nate. Yours, Buddy's, you both matter, and sometimes we all need a helping hand." Nate's eyes filled with tears, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking free. "I've been alone for so long," he admitted, his voice choked with sobs. "After Mary died, after I left the service, I forgot what it was like to have someone care." Marcus placed a comforting hand on Nate's shoulder, guiding him to a chair. "You're not alone anymore, Nate," he said softly. "And you won't be as long as I have anything to say about it." As they sat in the quiet waiting room, Marcus began to speak gently about the future. He talked about getting Nate and Buddy proper medical care, about accessing the veterans' benefits Nate was entitled to, but had never known how to claim. He spoke of community resources, of support groups for veterans, of people who could help repair Nate's house. At first, Nate seemed overwhelmed by it all, shrinking back from the prospect of so much change. But as Marcus continued to talk, painting a picture of a future where neither Nate nor Buddy would have to struggle alone, something in the old veteran's demeanor began to shift. "You really think all that's possible?" Nate asked, a hint of hope creeping into his voice for the first time. Marcus nodded firmly. "I know it is, Nate. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight, but I promise you, I'll be there every step of the way. We'll figure this out together." As the night wore on, Marcus and Nate talked more openly than they ever had before. Nate shared stories of his time in the service, of the friends he'd lost, of the struggles he'd faced upon returning home. He spoke of Mary, his voice softening with love and grief as he recounted their years together. Marcus listened, offering quiet support and understanding. He shared some of his own experiences too, the challenges he'd faced as a police officer, the times he'd felt helpless in the face of systemic issues, the small victories that kept him going. As dawn began to break, casting a soft glow through the clinic's windows, Dr. Chen emerged once more. Her face was tired but hopeful. "Buddy's stabilized," she announced. "He's not out of the woods yet, but he's responding well to treatment. With proper care and nutrition, I believe he has a good chance at recovery." The relief on Nate's face was palpable. For the first time since Marcus had arrived at his house, the old veteran smiled, a small, fragile thing, but genuine nonetheless. "Thank you," Nate said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. I don't know what I would have done if... Marcus squeezed Nate's shoulder gently. You don't have to think about that, he said. What matters is that you reached out when you needed help. That's not weakness, Nate, that's strength. As they prepared to leave the clinic, with Buddy settled comfortably in a warm blanket in the back seat of Marcus's car, the officer knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but looking at Nate's face, tired but with a newfound spark of hope, Marcus felt a sense of determination stronger than ever before. All right, Nate, Marcus said as they got into the car. Let's get you both home and settled. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we'll take it one step at a time. Nate nodded, his eyes fixed on Buddy in the rearview mirror. I still can't believe all this, he murmured. I've been alone for so long, I forgot what it was like to have someone in my corner. As they drove through the quiet early morning streets, Marcus began to outline a plan. First things first, we need to make sure you and Buddy have a safe, warm place to stay while we sort everything out. Your house, well, it needs some work before it's really livable. Nate's face fell at the mention of his home. I know it's not much, he said defensively, but it's all I have left of Mary. All our memories are there. Marcus nodded, understanding. I get that, Nate. We're not talking about getting rid of your home, but it might not be safe for you and Buddy right now. In the meantime, how would you feel about staying with me for a while? The offer hung in the air between them. Nate's eyes widened in surprise. With you? But I couldn't impose like that. You've already done so much. It's not an imposition, Marcus assured him. I've got a spare room that's just gathering dust. It would be good to put it to use. Plus, it would make it easier for me to help you navigate all the paperwork and appointments we've got ahead of us. Nate was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the idea. His independent nature warred with the undeniable need for help. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. If you're sure it wouldn't be too much trouble. Marcus smiled warmly. Not trouble at all, Nate. In fact, I insist. In the weeks following Buddy's emergency veterinary visit, Marcus began to plan the next steps in helping Nate. The old veteran's house was in desperate need of repair, and Marcus knew it would take significant work to make it safe and livable again. One evening, as they sat in Marcus's living room, Buddy curled up contentedly at Nate's feet. Marcus broached the subject. Nate, he began carefully, I've been thinking about your house. We need to get it fixed up so you and Buddy can go home safely. Nate's face fell, his eyes clouding with worry. I appreciate the thought, Marcus, but I can't afford repairs. I couldn't even pay for Buddy's medical bills. There's just no way I can handle something like this. Marcus leaned forward, his expression determined. I want to help, Nate. I have some savings, and I think we could at least get started on the most critical repairs. Nate shook his head, his pride warring with gratitude. That's too much, Marcus. You've already done so much for us. I can't ask you to spend your savings on my old house. You're not asking, I'm offering, Marcus insisted gently. But let me make some calls first. I have an idea. Over the next few days, Marcus reached out to various contacts in the community, fellow officers, local businesses, veteran support groups, and even some of Nate's old neighbors. To his surprise and delight, the response was overwhelming. A week later, Marcus took Nate back to his house for the first time since that fateful night. As they pulled up, Nate's jaw dropped in astonishment. The overgrown yard had been cleared, and a group of people were already hard at work. Some were repairing the sagging porch, others were replacing broken windows, and a team was up on the roof patching holes. What is all this? Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on Nate's shoulder. This, Nate, is your community. When people heard your story, they wanted to help. Everyone here volunteered their time and skills. As they got out of the car, people began to notice their arrival. A chorus of greetings rang out, and several folks came over to shake Nate's hand. There were fellow veterans from the support group, officers from Marcus's precinct, and even some faces Nate recognized from the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson, Nate's neighbor from 3 houses down, approached with a warm smile. "Nate Walker, it's so good to see you. We've missed you around here." Nate's eyes welled up with tears. I don't know what to say. I had no idea." Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "You're not alone, Nate. You never were. Sometimes all it takes is asking for help." As the day wore on, Nate found himself swept up in the activity. He shared stories with fellow veterans as they painted walls, laughed with neighbors as they planted new flowers in the front yard, and even found himself giving carpentry tips to some of the younger volunteers. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. The house, while still in need of work, looked more like a home than it had in years. As the volunteers began to pack up for the day, many promising to return the next weekend, Nate stood on his newly repaired porch, taking it all in. "I can't believe it," he said to Marcus, his voice thick with emotion. "All these people, they came out for me." Marcus nodded. "They did, Nate, and they'll keep coming until the job is done. But it's not just about fixing the house. We're all here for you, for anything you might need, now and in the future. That's what community is all about." Nate looked out at the departing volunteers, then down at Buddy, who was happily exploring the freshly mowed lawn. "I've been alone for so long," he said softly. "I forgot what it was like to be part of something bigger than myself, to have people care." As they stood there, watching the sun set on a day of hard work and newfound hope, Nate realized that his life had changed in more ways than he could have imagined. What had started with a desperate call on a lonely night had blossomed into a rediscovery of community, of purpose, and of the enduring power of human kindness.